In a world where justice often seems out of reach, one young woman's determination shines through. Maya Davis, a 17-year-old legal prodigy, takes on a powerful landlord to fight for a single mother's rights. Faced with intimidation, false accusations, and a system built to favor the rich and powerful, Maya's courage and unwavering belief in fairness drive her to stand tall against overwhelming odds. This is the story of how one person can change the course of their life and inspire a movement. Be sure to subscribe to our channel to start today's story with life stories. The courtroom was deathly silent. There was an almost palpable tension in the air, the kind that hangs heavily, pressing down on the hearts of everyone present. All eyes were on the young woman standing before Judge William Patterson, who was known for his sharp tongue and no-nonsense demeanor. Maya Davis, a calm and composed 17-year-old black teenager, had entered the courtroom with the kind of quiet confidence that belied her years. She was there to defend Teresa Harris, a single mother who had been wrongfully accused of breaking her lease and was facing eviction. But just moments before, Maya had been the target of ridicule. Judge Patterson, who had been dismissing her as a child playing dress-up, had spent the last 20 minutes mocking her for daring to represent herself in such a serious case. The judge's condescending tone echoed through the room, his sharp words cutting into the already fragile morale of the defendant. "You think you can fool this court," he sneered. "This is a courtroom, young lady, not a school play." His laughter rippled through the room as his eyes scanned the young girl standing in front of him. The insults had hit Maya. Of course. No one is immune to mockery, especially when it's so public, so harsh. But Maya had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to deal with the cruelty of the world is to keep your head high and rise above it. She knew this case meant more than just defending one mother, it meant standing up to an unjust system that would often ignore those without money or power. So, she stood tall, her shoulders straight, her heart steady. And then, when she was finally given the chance to speak, she did not flinch. Her voice, though youthful, rang out clear and unwavering, steady like a well-tuned instrument. She didn't let the judge's scorn affect her. Maya began to speak, her words flowing smoothly as she began to dismantle the prosecution's case. She wasn't just speaking from memory or reciting facts. No, her arguments were razor-sharp, each word carefully chosen, each point made with the precision of someone who had studied the law with the intensity of someone far beyond her years. It was as if, in that moment, the room had shifted, something had changed. People in the audience gasped as they realized that this teenager was no ordinary defendant. She was something more. Judge Patterson's smug expression slowly faded as his brows furrowed, and he looked at Maya with growing unease. He had expected to see a nervous, unqualified girl trying to play lawyer. What he saw instead was a young woman who, despite her age, possessed an undeniable command of the law. As Maya continued her argument, even the seasoned lawyers in the room were stunned by her knowledge of legal precedents and her unshakable confidence. She exposed the lies of the landlord, piece by piece, her words hanging in the air, each one a striking blow to the defense's case. One of the prosecutors, a man whose patience was clearly running thin, suddenly interjected, his voice filled with frustration. "Your Honor," he said, "I have reason to believe this individual is not who she claims to be." The courtroom held its breath as the tension mounted. The prosecutor seemed almost desperate to undermine the teenager's credibility, trying to put her back in her place. But Maya, ever calm, turned her piercing gaze toward him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Your Honor, I can provide my credentials if necessary," she replied, her voice steady, unwavering. "But I assure you, every word I've spoken is legally sound. Shall we continue?" The judge, his face now a deep shade of crimson, leaned forward, his voice cracking under the weight of his disbelief. "Who are you?" he demanded, his words thick with incredulity. Maya didn't flinch. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a pristine document, handing it to the bailiff. The paper passed up to the judge, and as he read it, his hands trembled. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The entire room waited in silence, as though everyone collectively held their breath. What had just happened? The document was simple enough, her bar exam certification. But to those in the courtroom, it was a bombshell. The girl standing before them had passed the bar exam at 16. She wasn't just any teenager. She was a certified legal prodigy. Someone who had quietly slipped under the radar. Until now. The room was filled with murmurs. Whispers traveling through the air as everyone began to piece together the truth. Judge Patterson, who had mocked her so ruthlessly, was now completely at a loss for words. He was an experienced judge. But what had just unfolded was something he had never seen before. The teenager, whom he had dismissed as a joke, was, in fact, more qualified than most of the people in that room. He looked at her in shock, his face slowly turning from crimson to pale. "Who are you?" he demanded once more, his voice low, almost a whisper now. Maya didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, looking at him with quiet dignity, as if she knew that the truth spoke for itself. And in that moment, the judge understood. He had underestimated her. He had belittled her. And now, it was too late. This was just the beginning. The courtroom may have been stunned, but Maya's resolve only grew stronger. She had come here to fight for justice. And no amount of mockery, no amount of ridicule, could stop her now. This fight was far from over. It was just beginning. Maya stood firm as Judge Patterson stared at the document in his trembling hands. The courtroom had gone silent. The tension in the air now palpable. All eyes were on her, and Maya could feel the weight of their gazes. Some were filled with awe, others with disbelief, and a few with a hint of fear. But Maya remained composed, her heart steady, even as the adrenaline of the moment coursed through her. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "This court will take a brief recess," he said, his voice shaky. He slammed his gavel down, signaling the break. But the sound seemed almost futile against the quiet chaos that had erupted in the room. The defense attorney and the prosecutor exchanged confused glances, unable to grasp what had just happened. Maya didn't take her eyes off the judge, her calmness almost unnerving. She had expected this moment. Even if she hadn't known exactly how it would unfold, she had been preparing for this battle her entire life. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, and silenced by a system that wasn't built for them. The bailiff motioned for everyone to leave the courtroom while the judge retreated to his chambers. Maya, though, remained seated at the plaintiff's table, her fingers intertwined in front of her as she focused on the task ahead. Teresa, her client, sat beside her, her hands trembling. She was nervous, still trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. The shock was written all over her face. "Are you okay?" Maya asked softly, glancing at Teresa. Teresa nodded but didn't speak. She was still processing the information about Maya's true identity. To her, Maya had always seemed like a kid who loved to read law books. But now, she understood the depth of her expertise. It was hard to believe, but she couldn't deny the truth that was sitting right in front of her. Maya smiled gently at Teresa, trying to reassure her. "Don't worry," she said. "We've got this." Minutes later, the courtroom doors reopened, and Judge Patterson returned to the bench, his face now an unreadable mask. There was no smugness left in his expression, no condescension. Instead, there was something else, perhaps a realization of just how far he had misjudged the situation. "This court will resume," he said, his voice now firm, more authoritative than before. "Miss Davis, you may continue." Maya stood up, her body moving with a calm grace. She was no longer the young girl trying to prove herself. In that moment, she was every bit the attorney she had always been, and her every move exuded a quiet, Undeniable confidence. She glanced at Teresa, who gave her a tentative smile before nodding in support. Maya turned back to the judge, her voice steady. "Your Honor, I would like to present additional evidence," she said. And as she spoke, she passed a set of documents up to the judge. These were the same emails Teresa had exchanged with the landlord. Emails that contradicted the landlord's testimony about the supposed lease violations. Maya had carefully highlighted the key phrases in yellow, ensuring nothing could be missed. Judge Patterson flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing as he read. His earlier frustration had transformed into something else, perhaps an understanding that he had underestimated not just Maya, but the case she was building. After a few moments, he looked up, his face serious. "Mr. Cole," the judge addressed the landlord's attorney, "can you explain these emails? They directly contradict your client's testimony." Mr. Cole, the landlord's attorney, hesitated, his face flushed with frustration. And for the first time, he appeared unsettled. "Your Honor, these emails could have been fabricated. We would need time to verify their authenticity." Maya, however, wasn't fazed. "Your Honor," she said with calm certainty, "I anticipated that argument. Here is the chain of custody for these emails, along with metadata verification from a certified digital forensics expert." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The judge studied the evidence carefully, clearly impressed by the level of detail and preparation. The defense team was caught off guard, unable to counter the evidence that Maya had so methodically presented. "Unless you can provide concrete evidence to refute this," Judge Patterson said, his voice now colder than before, "I will have no choice but to accept this evidence as valid." The landlord's attorney, clearly flustered, stammered, "Your Honor, we need additional time to review." "Denied," the judge interrupted, his tone icy. "We've already spent too much time on this matter. Miss Davis, please continue." Maya didn't need any further prompting. She continued to press the case, citing legal precedents that reinforced her client's position. The landlord's defense crumbled under the weight of her arguments. She felt the shift in the room, the way the energy changed. It was as if everyone could finally see the truth for what it was. At one point, the landlord, a burly man with a scowl etched on his face, leaned over to whisper furiously to his attorney. Maya noticed, but she didn't let it distract her. She knew what they were trying to do. They were trying to intimidate her. But Maya wasn't the type to back down. Not now. Not ever. Her arguments grew stronger with each passing moment, her confidence rising as she tore apart the landlord's defense. The prosecution's case was falling apart, and it became increasingly clear that the landlord had been using his power to exploit his tenants for far too long. But just as the momentum seemed to be shifting in her favor, something unexpected happened. The landlord, losing his grip on his composure, suddenly stood up. His face was red with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. "She's lying," he shouted, pointing accusingly at Maya. "This whole thing is a setup. There's no way a kid like her knows all this legal stuff." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge, now visibly irritated, slammed his gavel down repeatedly. "Order," he shouted. "Order in the court." Maya took a deep breath, maintaining her calm. She was used to these kinds of outbursts, people who, when faced with the truth, resorted to desperation. But she wasn't going to let this derail her. She turned to the judge and said, "If Mr. Reynolds has any evidence to support his accusations, I invite him to present it. Otherwise, I request that the court focus on the facts." The judge nodded, his expression stern. "Mr. Reynolds, you will remain silent unless called upon to speak. Miss Davis, continue." With that, Maya returned to her seat, her heart pounding, but her mind as clear as ever. She knew that they were winning this battle. But the war, well, the war was just beginning. As Maya sat back down at the plaintiff's table, The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted once again. The once confident and condescending air around the landlord's team had disappeared, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty. Maya, however, remained focused. She wasn't about to let the landlord's outburst deter her. If anything, it only fueled her determination. The stakes of the case had just been raised, and she had no intention of backing down now. Her mind was sharp as she prepared for the next phase of the hearing. She had already dismantled their primary defenses, and now she had to ensure the case was sealed. The weight of the responsibility was not lost on her. But Maya had learned long ago to shoulder burdens with grace. She was not just fighting for Teresa Harris anymore, she was fighting for something much bigger. She was fighting for justice. She was fighting for all the people who had been oppressed, ignored, and denied the opportunity to have their voices heard. The courtroom was silent once more, the air thick with tension. The defense team, having failed to dismiss her evidence, now seemed to be scrambling for any shred of credibility they could salvage. But the more they grasped, the more transparent their attempts became. Each piece of evidence that Maya presented seemed to chip away at their arguments, and every word she spoke was like a hammer pounding the final nails into their coffin. As the trial continued, Maya presented additional pieces of evidence, each one further undermining the landlord's claims. The documents were meticulous, each one building upon the last, creating a case so airtight that it was impossible to ignore. The landlord's defense lawyer, Mr. Cole, grew visibly agitated as Maya's arguments gained traction. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a frustrated, almost panicked energy. But Maya kept her composure. She had worked too hard for this moment to let it slip away. Her voice was steady and calm as she approached the bench once again, presenting the latest round of evidence. She handed over copies of email correspondence between Teresa and the landlord. Emails that contradicted everything the landlord had claimed about lease violations. Judge Patterson, whose earlier disbelief had turned into wary respect, now seemed to fully understand the depth of the teenager's legal expertise. His eyes scanned the documents, his brow furrowing as he read through them. For the first time since the trial began, Maya saw him pause, his attention fully engaged with her case. Mr. Cole, Judge Patterson finally said, his voice sharp. Do you have an explanation for these emails? They directly contradict your client's testimony. The courtroom held its breath. Mr. Cole, clearly flustered, tried to compose himself before responding. But his words faltered. Your Honor, he stammered. These emails are irrelevant. They don't change the fact that my client's lease agreement was violated. Maya, without missing a beat, responded. Your Honor, I've also brought evidence to show that these emails were not only authentic but also corroborated by a certified forensics expert. The room was still. There was no escaping the truth that Maya had laid bare. The landlord's lawyer, who had spent so much time attacking her credibility, now had no choice but to retreat. Unless you have a solid reason to challenge the authenticity of this evidence. Mr. Cole, Judge Patterson said, his voice stern, I will accept it as valid. Maya nodded slightly, her expression calm but her heart racing. The landlord's defense was crumbling before her eyes. She had presented her case with precision, carefully tying each piece of evidence together to form an unbreakable narrative. She could see the cracks forming in the defense's facade, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. But as the judge made his ruling, Maya noticed something unsettling. The landlord, sitting on the other side of the courtroom, shifted in his seat uncomfortably. His face was pale, his jaw clenched in frustration. He could feel the walls closing in on him, and it was clear that he knew he was losing. The day dragged on, with more objections from the defense. But each time Maya stood her ground, she had no intention of allowing them to derail the case. With each argument, each piece of evidence, she drove home the fact that Teresa Harris was the victim in this situation. not the perpetrator of some imagined lease violation. As the court session finally drew to a close, Maya felt a sense of quiet triumph. The day had gone well. They had come a long way, and the truth had been laid bare for all to see. But she also knew that the battle was not yet over. There would be more obstacles, more challenges ahead. The landlord was a powerful man, and he would not go down easily. Maya walked out of the courtroom, her mind still processing the events of the day. Teresa walked beside her, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Are we really going to win this?" she asked quietly, the doubt still lingering in her voice. Maya turned to look at her, offering a reassuring smile. "We're not just going to win this, Teresa. We're going to expose the truth. And that's the most important thing. The world may not always be fair, but Maya had learned long ago that it was up to those who had the power to change it. And now, she had the power. With each victory, with each step forward, she was beginning to see how the system could be shifted. The fight for justice wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The days following the courtroom session felt like a whirlwind. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that, while the battle had been a significant victory, the true war was just beginning. As much as she felt the weight of the win, the victory was marred by something much deeper. The system wasn't simply built to challenge individual cases, it was a system designed to favor the powerful. And that was something Maya couldn't ignore, no matter how small her initial success had seemed. Teresa, despite her initial excitement, was now more aware than ever of the forces they were up against. The landlord's team was relentless. The courtroom drama had become just another page in a much larger book, a book filled with corruption, manipulation, and greed. And as Maya stepped out of the courthouse that day, she realized that her fight was far more profound than she had ever anticipated. In the days that followed, whispers started to circulate about the landlord's counterattack. The news had spread like wildfire. He wasn't just a disgruntled property owner trying to protect his business, he was a man who had been hiding behind layers of deceit, using his wealth and influence to ensure that the tenants he exploited had no voice. And now, Maya had exposed him. That was a threat he wouldn't easily overlook. One evening, as Maya sat with her grandmother Clara at their small kitchen table, the phone rang. It was the kind of call that no one ever expects. But when it comes, the urgency in the voice on the other end makes your heart skip a beat. "Maya, we need to talk," Jacob Harris, the family lawyer, said, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "There's been a development." Maya felt a sudden chill wash over her. She exchanged a brief glance with Clara before answering, trying to keep her voice steady. "What happened?" "It's about the landlord," Jacob continued. "He's taking things up a notch. I'm afraid he's getting desperate." Desperate. Maya had known that this moment would come, but hearing it from Jacob's voice made the reality hit home. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "What exactly does he have in mind?" Jacob hesitated before answering. "He's filed a counterclaim, accusing you of fabricating evidence. And the police are involved. They want to question you." Maya felt her stomach drop. For a moment, everything else around her seemed to blur. This was more than just a legal tactic, it was a move designed to intimidate, to discredit, and to push her into a corner. She had expected the landlord to fight back, but the gravity of it hit her hard. This wasn't just about the case anymore. This was about silencing her, about stopping her from exposing the truth. She knew what this meant. It meant that everything she had worked for, the hours spent researching, the arguments made in court, the credibility she had painstakingly built, was now at risk. They weren't just going to roll over. They had the power to fight back. And they were using it. The next morning, when Maya arrived at the courthouse, she was greeted by the sight of police officers standing near the entrance. One of them, a man in uniform, looked over at her and began walking toward her. Maya's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "Miss Davis," the officer said. his tone grim. "We need to speak with you." Maya didn't flinch. She had been expecting this moment. "Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her voice calm and steady. The officer nodded toward the landlord, who was standing across the lobby, smirking smugly. "We've received a report from Mr. Reynolds," the officer said. "He's alleging that you falsified evidence in this case." Maya's pulse quickened. The accusation was serious. But she wasn't about to let it rattle her. "What evidence does he have to support this claim?" she asked, her voice firm. The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly not wanting to be the bearer of bad news. "We're not here to make a judgment," he replied. "We're just doing our due diligence. We need you to come down to the station to answer some questions." Maya met the officer's gaze, her expression unflinching. "I understand," she said, keeping her voice steady, "but I would like to speak with my legal counsel before I go anywhere." The officer hesitated but then nodded. "Fine. But don't take too long." Maya turned to Teresa, who had caught up with her and was now standing by her side, visibly anxious. "Maya," Teresa whispered, "what if they arrest you? What if this is all just to get you out of the way?" Maya placed a reassuring hand on Teresa's shoulder, her voice calm but firm. "This is a scare tactic, Teresa. They're trying to rattle us because they know their case is falling apart. But I've done nothing wrong. And they have no proof otherwise. Stay calm. And don't speak to anyone else about this. Let's handle this the right way." With that, Maya walked into the police station, her head held high, her steps resolute. Inside, she was led into a small interrogation room where the officer sat across from her, his face stone cold. "Miss Davis," he began, his voice almost apologetic, "you're not under arrest. But we need to ask you some questions about the evidence you submitted in court. Mr. Reynolds claims that it was fabricated." Maya remained composed, her hands folded neatly on the table. "The evidence I submitted is authentic," she said, her voice unwavering. "I have documentation to prove its validity, including a chain of custody report from a certified digital forensics expert." The officer frowned slightly. "Do you have those documents with you?" "They're in my case file." Maya replied calmly. "They're available for review if you'd like." The officer looked at her for a moment before leaning back in his chair, clearly trying to find a way to challenge her. But Maya knew he wouldn't succeed. The truth was on her side, and no amount of intimidation would change that. Later that evening, when Maya left the station, the weight of the events started to sink in. She had walked into that interrogation room with a calm demeanor. But inside, the gravity of the situation was starting to wear on her. This fight was becoming personal. It wasn't just about standing up for Teresa anymore, it was about standing up for everything Maya had worked for. And she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her. The days following her visit to the police station were an emotional roller coaster for Maya. The weight of the accusations, the tension in the air, and the constant scrutiny made it difficult to focus on anything other than the case. But Maya refused to let the distractions get to her. She knew that the path she had chosen was never going to be easy. If anything, the obstacles only strengthened her resolve. Every night, after the long hours spent at the courthouse, she would sit in her grandmother Clara's living room, poring over case files, reviewing documents, and preparing for the next phase of the trial. But despite her determination, doubt started to creep in. It wasn't just the pressure of the case that was wearing on her, it was the realization that the forces she was up against were far more powerful than she had originally anticipated. Maya knew the landlord wouldn't back down easily. His attempt to accuse her of fabricating evidence was just the beginning. He had money, influence, and a team of lawyers ready to fight dirty. And as the trial continued, it became more and more evident that the tactics they were using weren't just about the case, they were about intimidating Maya and getting her to walk away. One evening, as Maya sat at the kitchen table with her grandmother, Clara's concerned voice broke through her thoughts. "You're doing too much, Maya," Clara said, her eyes soft but firm. You've already accomplished so much. But you have to take care of yourself, too. Maya smiled weakly, grateful for her grandmother's words. I know, Grandma. But I can't stop now. There are too many people counting on me. And I can't back down. Not when we're so close. Clara nodded. But the worry on her face was still evident. Maya had always been a fighter. But Clara had seen the toll the fight was taking on her. Maya hadn't slept much in days. The pressure. The constant fear of retaliation. The never-ending pile of legal paperwork, it was all starting to take a toll on her. But Clara knew that her granddaughter's determination was unstoppable. Still, she couldn't help but feel a growing concern that Maya was carrying too much on her shoulders. The next morning, as Maya walked into the courthouse, she noticed something unusual. Two men in suits were standing near the entrance, speaking quietly with the landlord. One of the men looked at Maya as she approached, his gaze cold and calculating. The second man took a step toward her, blocking her path. Miss Davis, the first man said, his voice low and firm. We need to talk. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She had expected the landlord's team to escalate things. But this was different. She had no idea who these men were. But something about their demeanor told her that they weren't just ordinary lawyers. The tension in the air was thick. And Maya's instincts kicked in. She had to stay calm. I don't know what this is about, Maya replied, her voice steady but with a slight edge. But if you have something to say, you can do it in court. I'm not interested in private conversations. The man smiled. But it wasn't a smile that reassured her. It was cold. Calculating. This isn't about the case, he said. This is about the bigger picture. Your little crusade against Mr. Reynolds isn't going to end well for you. Maya's stomach twisted. She had expected threats. But hearing them so directly from these men made her realize just how far the landlord was willing to go to silence her. They weren't just trying to win the case, they were trying to intimidate her. Make her feel small. Make her doubt herself. The second man spoke up. We don't want to see you hurt, Miss Davis. But you have to understand that there are people who don't appreciate the kind of attention you're drawing to yourself. There's a reason you should back off. Maya stood tall, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the weight of their words. But she wasn't about to let them break her. If that's a threat, I'll take it as such, she said. Her voice calm but firm. But I won't be intimidated. You can try to scare me. But it won't work. I'm not going anywhere. The men exchanged glances. And for a moment, Maya felt the growing weight of their stares. But then, the moment passed. The first man's expression shifted. A flicker of respect, or perhaps frustration, crossing his face. We'll see how long your resolve holds up, Miss Davis, he said, his voice low, before turning and walking away with the other man. Maya stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, but her mind clearer than ever. She had expected something like this. But the coldness of their words reminded her just how high the stakes were. She was no longer just fighting for justice, she was fighting for her own freedom. Her own future. They wanted to break her. To make her afraid. But Maya wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. When she entered the courtroom later that morning, she could feel the shift. The landlord's attorney, Mr. Cole, stood at his table with a look of barely concealed frustration. His eyes flickered toward Maya as she entered. But he didn't speak. The man in the suit, the one who had spoken to her outside, was sitting behind him, observing the proceedings with a quiet intensity. Maya took her seat, her hands folded neatly on the table, her heart still racing from the encounter. She knew that today would be a critical turning point. She couldn't let the threats distract her. She had to stay focused. And then, as she glanced up at the judge's bench, she realized something. This wasn't just about one case. This was about everything. This was about standing up to a system that let people like Mr. Reynolds thrive while others suffered. She had come this far. She wasn't about to back down now. As the trial resumed, Maya's mind raced. She had to outsmart them. She had to keep pushing forward. No matter how high the stakes. The fight wasn't over, it was just heating up. And Maya was ready for whatever came next. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the trial progressed. Maya could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. It was as though every word she spoke, every argument she made, carried not just the weight of her client's case but the hopes of all those who had been mistreated by the system. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving a point that justice could prevail, even in the face of overwhelming power. Despite the threats and the mounting pressure, Maya had never felt more resolute. The intimidation outside the courthouse had only fueled her determination to keep going. She wasn't going to let Mr. Reynolds or his powerful allies dictate the terms of the fight. Not now. Not ever. Her hands were steady as she prepared her next round of arguments, each one more decisive than the last. The judge, who had once mocked her, now looked at her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. It was clear that he had underestimated her from the start. But Maya had proven herself. She had shown that she was more than just a teenager, she was a force to be reckoned with. As the day wore on, the prosecution continued to struggle, unable to counter Maya's evidence. She had anticipated their every move, presenting documents, emails, and testimonies that shattered their defense. She had become the architect of her own victory, building her case layer by layer, ensuring that there was no room for doubt. But just when it seemed as though the landlord's team had no ground left to stand on, they pulled out a new tactic, one that would test Maya's resolve in ways she hadn't expected. Mr. Cole, the landlord's attorney, stood up suddenly, his voice cutting through the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, his tone almost smug, "we have just received new evidence that we believe will change the course of this case." A murmur ran through the room. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't anticipated this. The last thing she needed was another twist in the case, especially one that could throw everything into chaos. The judge, visibly intrigued, nodded for Mr. Cole to proceed. "What is this new evidence?" Judge Patterson asked, his voice calm but expectant. Mr. Cole reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Your Honor, these are financial records that suggest Miss Harris has been withholding information about her income," he said, handing the folder to the judge. "This evidence directly challenges her claims of financial hardship." Maya felt a rush of frustration flood her chest. This was the last thing she needed. It was clear that the landlord was playing dirty, but she had expected them to pull out a desperate move eventually. Still, she had no intention of letting this derail everything they had fought for. The judge flipped through the pages of the folder, his expression growing more serious with each page. Maya's mind raced. She knew Teresa's financial records inside and out. Teresa had been open and transparent about her situation from the start. The landlord's team was simply trying to create doubt, to muddy the waters in hopes of buying more time. "Miss Davis," Judge Patterson said, looking up from the documents, "have you seen these financial records before?" Maya stood up, her heart pounding. "No, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. "This is the first time I've seen this evidence." She could see the wheels turning in the judge's mind. He had to decide whether to admit this new evidence or allow Maya to challenge it. It was a pivotal moment, one that could shift the entire case. But Maya wasn't about to let them win with this underhanded tactic. She needed time to examine the documents thoroughly, to verify their authenticity. "Your Honor," Maya said, "I request time to review this evidence. The nature of these allegations is serious, and I believe it is only fair that we are given time to ensure the integrity of these records." Judge Patterson nodded, considering her request. "Very well. The plaintiff will have until tomorrow morning to review this evidence. Court is adjourned for the day." Maya exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The reprieve was brief, but it gave her the time she needed to analyze the new evidence. She wasn't about to let this move from the landlord's team catch her off guard. She would fight back, just as she had from the very beginning. Later that evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the financial records, she felt a wave of doubt wash over her. What if the landlord's team had found something real? What if they had uncovered an inconsistency in Teresa's financial situation that could jeopardize everything? Maya tried to push the thoughts aside, but they lingered, gnawing at her. She had always prided herself on her ability to think critically, to see through deception. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. She had worked too hard, come too far, to let this be the thing that brought it all crashing down. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Jacob, her family lawyer. "We've been through this before." Maya, the message read. "Don't let them win with tactics like this. You know what they're doing. Keep your head clear and stay focused. We'll get through this." Maya smiled slightly at the words of encouragement. Jacob had always been a steady presence in her life, reminding her to keep her focus even when things seemed impossible. She typed a quick reply, "Thanks, Jacob. I won't let them get to me." She knew he was right. The landlord's team had nothing left to offer but distractions and lies. She couldn't let them pull her off course. As the night grew late, Maya closed her laptop and took a deep breath. Tomorrow would be a new day, and she was ready for whatever came next. She would keep pushing, keep fighting, because the truth was on her side. She had come too far to stop now. As the days went by, Maya's resolve only grew stronger. She faced each new challenge head-on, always with the same unwavering belief in justice. With the evidence she had gathered and the support of her team, Maya finally secured a victory for Teresa, exposing the landlord's lies and manipulation. But the battle didn't end there. Maya's journey sparked something much bigger, a movement for tenants' rights that would spread far beyond the courthouse. As Maya stood in the courtroom that final day, hearing the judge rule in Teresa's favor, she knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was long, but it was always worth it. She smiled, her heart full, knowing that the truth had triumphed. And with that, she made her promise to continue the fight, never backing down. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring life stories.